All right, ladies and gentlemen, orcs and elves, once again, I am your host, Drew the Dragonslayer Thomas, coming to you live both online and in person from the Norman Rockwell Museum. The mission of the museum is to illuminate the power of American illustration art to reflect and shape society and advance the enduring values of kindness, respect, and social equity that's portrayed in Norman Rockwell's art. Before we begin, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. It is with great gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land on which the museum was built. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munson community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So now I'd like to welcome you all to the third installment of our Tuesday program, Meet the Artist series, where we'll be in conversation with some of the most talented illustrators and painters of our generation. And with you all, the audiences, both online and in person. We invite you to be a part of the conversation as well and ask any questions you might have. We are thrilled to be with Tyler Jacobson. Tyler will speak about his life and work. First, he'll share some of his earliest work. He'll talk about art school leading to conversation about his professional work and art for D&D, Magic the Gathering, and Wizards of the Coast, his illustration work, and then his visual development and concept artwork. Finally, he'll speak to his process. We're grouping questions by theme, so we invite you to ask relevant questions as he shares about each theme. And at the end, we'll open the floor for additional questions. And now I'd like to introduce Jesse Kowalski, the curator of the fantasy exhibit Enchanted, who has spent the last 6 years organizing exhibitions at the Norman Rockwell Museum as a curator of exhibitions. Welcome, Jesse.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, thrilled to have Tyler here tonight. Tyler Jacobson combines vivid colors with a captivating composition to emphasize the action-packed scenes in his work. He's created illustrations for role-playing games and gaming companies such as Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and Paizo Publishing. Periodicals such as Entertainment Weekly, The New Yorker, and Sports Illustrated, and other clients including the Boy Scouts of America. Jacobson graduated from the Academy of Art in San Francisco in 2009. Just 1 year later, he received the Jack Gahn Award for Best Emerging Artist. And at the Spectrum 19 Awards in 2012, he won the gold medal in advertising. And his artwork continues to make regular appearances in the annual Spectrum catalog. In the Enchanted exhibition, we include 2 works by Jacobson. An Egyptian-themed image for the cover of Paizo Publishing's 2016 release, Mummy's Mask, and also probably one of the most popular images to emerge from the latest iteration of Dungeons & Dragons, the Red Dragon image that's featured on the cover of the Dungeon Master screen. An additional image, Huatli Warrior Poet, will travel to the 2 museums hosting the exhibit, and that painting was featured on a 2018 card for Magic the Gathering. For the last 12 years, Tyler's work has appeared on several book covers for Dungeons & Dragons, including 2 of the game's most important books, The Player's Handbook and The Dungeon Master's Guide. His work is also presented on the cover of Volo's Guide to Monsters, Out of the Abyss, and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. And over the last decade, Jacobson's also been creating artwork for Magic the Gathering, including a terrific card, Exalted Angel, signed prints of which are available in the museum store. And for the last 2 years, he's been focusing on Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, a Magic the Gathering release that brings the lands, creatures, and style of D&D onto the cards of Magic the Gathering. And that set will be released this Friday. Finally, less than 2 weeks ago, Flesk Publications began a Kickstarter campaign to publish a retrospective on Jacobson's career, aptly titled The Art of Tyler Jacobson. And they surpassed their funding goal by a substantial margin in just a matter of hours. So look out, he's on fire. Here comes Tyler Jacobson.
Thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you, Drew, for the amazing, both of your amazing introductions. I'm amazed that you guys have me here today, and it's a dream come true, really. So thank you all. So I guess should we just jump right into, you introduced me very nicely, so I figure we should maybe just jump into slides, and
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
have to talk too much about my past. All right, well, let's see. I'll just start with a quick, we're going to go down a little bit of memory lane for everybody. How about that? So here we go. Let's get in here. All right, here we are. Everyone has to start somewhere. So I obviously started early on in crayon. Hopefully you all can see this image. This is, I guess I began in a fantasy realm. You know, I mean, obviously dinosaurs are real creatures, and we're real creatures, but I started out here because I don't know, as I guess a lot of artists you guys have had on in the past, they start out just drawing every day as little kids. So that's I would say where I began, and I want to move everyone through sort of these are some of my early, before I had any inspiration other than cartoons and I'd say comic books. But I started getting into fantasy work maybe about 8th grade or a little earlier than that, when I started playing D&D and Magic. And I didn't really understand that there was so much art built into these games. And so here we have a drawing that I did that's based off of another artist that was in the recent Enchanted opening and at the show, Tony DiRolizzi. And his work really inspired me as a young kid. So this is me when I'm in, I want to say 8th grade, but it might have been 7th or 6th grade. But this is me basically trying to copy a dragon that he had in one of the D&D manuals. So obviously really early on, Tony was a big inspiration for me. But I had a number of illustrators that inspired me pretty heavily when I started becoming I would say when I started focusing on becoming a professional artist. And that when I started doing that focus, this was back in when I started going to the Academy of Art University in San Francisco. Before that, I sort of was, I would say I was a bit rudderless when it came to my art education. I went to Gonzaga University originally for biology, and I studied there for 2 years to become a scientist, and just wasn't fitting for me. Chemistry was really kicking my butt, and all of the, I guess, math related aspects of science were not for me. So I was studying ceramics, I was studying painting, drawing, printmaking, everything I could. And as soon as I left that school, I decided to focus in on illustration. And I went to the Academy of Art, and there I had a number of amazing teachers, including people like Chuck Pyle and Bill Mon. But I also, me and my friends, we pretty heavily went to school on illustrators that were working at the time that we were in art school. And so this image I have up here of, sorry, it's kind of small, but I couldn't really find a bigger one. This is a piece by Greg Manchez, Above the Timberline. This was a piece that was very influential for me, I'd say, in my early art career. I think he had done the massive black demo painting for this when I was in my 2nd year of school. And I just kind of studied every little aspect of it, all of his edge control, the way he dealt with fabric, the way he dealt with movement. These all became things that I strived to find in my work. And as we kind of get into my art school portfolio here in a minute, you'll kind of see, you probably see some of those influences of Greg's approach to oil painting. Another big, huge influence for me was movie posters. And the biggest movie poster guy of them all as I was growing up was a guy named Drew Struzan, who did pretty much every movie poster you've probably seen in the 80s and early 90s. He was sort of he came after an artist named Richard Amsel, who did a lot of movie posters and in a similar style. And then when Amsel left the scene, Struzan kind of took over that mantle and really made it his own and made it something really special. So that kind of art really influenced me as a kid growing up, seeing them on all my favorite movies. Here's his legendary Temple of Doom poster. Here's another, it's a really fairly small image, I apologize. this is a big poster, artistic poster that inspired me. And I guess not too many people know that this painting was done by Thomas Blackshear. I even asked him at the opening about it, and he said that he had a much better painting that the studio and Ridley Scott didn't want to use. But I always really loved this piece, so I told him that maybe I'm the only fan out there of it, but it's just an amazing painting. And this kind of stuff, because I was such a movie nut and still am when I was a kid, this kind of stuff really fired up my imagination. And I don't think it took maybe 15 years for me to realize that this could actually be my career. Here's another piece by Thomas Blackshear, his King Kong piece, another big influence for me. And then these guys are sort of production artists, and they did a lot of posters and big production work, but there was a sort of deep well of fantasy illustrators that inspired me as well. I mean, a lot of people are inspired by Frazetta, and I was, of course, as well as lots of comic artists, but a couple of the really big guys were, another small image, apologies, but this is a piece by Angus McBride, who's a big fantasy artist and historical artist that I just absolutely loved when I was a kid and going through art school. And he did some pieces for, I mean, he's one of those artists that is incredibly prolific, but he did some work for the Lord of the Rings. These are some of his Lord of the Rings pieces. I was also a big, huge fan of John Howe. This is some of the work that he did that kind of inspired Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, as well as Alan Lee. And this is Alan Lee's watercolor painting of Edoras from Lord of the Rings. I'm also a big, huge Lord of the Rings fan. And while it's not necessarily a subject I've tackled, I'm kind of saving it. You know, it's one of those subjects where I'm almost afraid to tackle it because it means so much to me. So I'd like to leave it to these great artists that painted so much Lord of the Rings ahead of me. So that kind of, those are inspirations for me. And I think it's always been fantasy art that's been my favorite thing. I'll show you some examples of work that it's not really fantasy, or it's just other genres. But fantasy has always been my target, and I really haven't done too much sci-fi work. It's been mostly fantasy. So I kind of want to show you some of the work I did in art school. If there's a point in here, before I get into the art school stuff, where there's questions, maybe have it after the art school stuff, and then we can jump into some questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So here's some of the work I did in art school. When the program I went through at the Academy of Arts sort of asked us to create what they called a thesis project. So it was a body of work that inhabited, or that encompassed, what we wanted to do with our careers. So most of the work I did, I would say, was half and half visual development for video games and film, as well as illustrations. I would say I didn't really know what I was doing back then for the visual development stuff. So the ultimate focus in the end, when I was graduating and was brought before the directors of the program to present my work, most of it was illustrations. And the illustrations I chose were sort of themed off of tragic characters in literature, or hubristic characters that end up being pretty tragic in the end based on their choices. So this first one was, I did a series of paintings on Captain Ahab from Moby Dick and his obsession on killing this whale that named him. These are a few selections from that, but just pointing out, you can kind of see where I have this sort of chunky paint marks, and that is Greg Manchez's influence on my oil painting back then. I always like to point this out because it's really important to know that every artist has influences that kind of dictate what their style is going to become. And we pull from all kinds of artists and we find out what works best for us, and that ends up becoming our signature mark. I don't know if I was ever necessarily aware of it, but it's where I began, and I eventually, I guess, established something that I would say was my own style. But this, I would say, is the beginning of me kind of figuring out how to make marks, how to paint the way I want. And this was all in oils back then. This was another Ahab piece kind of inspired by those old pirate Howard Pyle paintings. And NCY, both of them. Another subject, tragic character I tackled unexpectedly would be Beowulf. From Beowulf himself wasn't the tragic character, but Grendel was kind of the tragic creature. There's a book, I believe that our author's name was Robert Garner. He wrote a book from Grendel's point of view, and I found that very inspiring. I love dogs and animals, and was going to try and be a biologist that worked with animals. So seeing that perspective of Grendel being sort of a creature that wasn't necessarily an evil monster was interesting to me. So I did some work on that subject. And these are the two pieces. This is sort of Grendel sadly dying alone in the snow. So that would encompass my art school work. And pretty quickly out of that, I started doing some production work. But I think this is a great spot to kind of have a little break, and we can chat, and maybe there's some questions we can answer as we move on.
Sure. There's a lot of questions about your early life and your art school, but you did touch on this question. I just want to ask, it was one of the first questions. What was it like to be exhibited alongside artists you idolized like Thomas Blackshear and Greg Manches?
Oh, I mean, it was a dream come true, really. It was hard for me to even believe it at first when Jesse reached out and asked me about having my work in the museum. First of all, I'd never been to the museum, so being in a museum that is, dedicated to the legend that is Norman Rockwell is beyond an honor. But then to be exhibited next to Tony Derlizzi, Greg Manches, Thomas Blackshear, Donato Giancola, Brahm had a few pieces in there, James Gurney. And these guys are legends, and I've always looked up to them as I've, become a professional artist. And it's truly an honor to get to, I guess, be considered amongst them, people that I thought inspired me to become an artist, to now be, I guess, one of their peers, which is just really wonderful. So I can't thank everyone at the Rockwell Museum enough for that opportunity.
All right, thank you. Another question we have, somebody asked, was there a moment that you knew you wanted to become an artist instead of a scientist?
Yes, there was. It was called chemistry class, and it was incredibly difficult for me. And I would say both my aunt and uncle are research scientists. My aunt's a PhD in microbiology, so I was sort of like, oh, okay, this is a thing I could do. And I think I remember messaging her and being like, chemistry is really difficult. Why didn't you tell me about this? And that was, I would say, when I was pretty much failing chemistry and needed to drop it in order to save my grade, I was like, I think this isn't for me. And they did have Gonzaga had a pretty robust fine art program. So I was like, well, I'll just learn everything I possibly can here. And I think, honestly, the most stuff I learned there was ceramics. I did a ton of ceramics. I basically majored in ceramics. So it was a very interesting place to start. But yeah, it was chemistry. I would say it was 2001. I had a chemistry lab where I was just completely lost, and so I dropped that major pretty quick.
Thank you. I'm sure many people relate to that, including myself. Anyways,
don't be discouraged, everybody. Continue to love science. You just don't necessarily have to become a research scientist.
No, not for everybody. Another question: as a very young person, you showed dinosaurs flying on land and swimming in one image. I wonder if this early recognition of ways to be on the planet are a precursor to expanding your edges to fantastical characters and lands.
Wow, I mean, that's a great observation. I don't know thank you. It sounds more like a compliment than a question.
Yeah.
No, I would say, yeah, I guess, I don't know. I guess I had an early eye for composition. As you saw in that image, the horizon line was very high. So I was really playing around with that golden ratio.
Yeah, Tyler, I was wondering, were there certain people who inspired you growing up, or what about movies or books or TV shows?
Movie-wise, I would honestly say movies are probably like the biggest inspiration for me. And most of it came from a lot of Jim Henson films. Not necessarily his work with, Sesame Street or the Muppets. It was a lot of his really darker stuff. So The Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, those kinds of works that just had a really beautiful amount of art that went into the development of the film, and all the puppet work and the special effects. And that actually led me down a sort of tangent of my obsession with art, was special effects. So I was really into special effects done by Stan Winston Studio in movies like The Predator and Terminator, and all of that really great practical effects work. All that kind of stuff really culminated in inspiring me into being a storyteller through imagery. I know that's all movie stuff, and there was probably a huge time in my life where I really wanted to get into film production, and I'm not counting it out, of course, but that was those were heavy influences when I was younger.
And have you done any concept art for films?
I'd say film adjacent kind of stuff. I've done I would say a little tiny bit of early stuff with Marvel work, but it was more on the production side. And then eventually probably went to some film stuff, but it hasn't been too much. Most of my career focus has been with game development.
We've got a few more early life questions. Somebody asked, do you have a single painting that you idolized as a kid?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, actually. Yeah. So when I was younger, I was really into a game out of England, out of Nottingham, really. It's a tabletop miniature game called Warhammer 40K. And I don't even know if it has a specific name, but there's a painting done by an artist who still works and does amazing work today, Karl Kopinski. He did a piece of, what you'd call a space marine, a Crimson Fist space marine. And I think I would tear that out of every book I could get or every magazine I could get. And I was thinking about it earlier before we were preparing for this, and I just couldn't find, I had taken so many versions of that out of the books or magazines, out of this one painting that he did of this space marine. And I couldn't find an image of it to put up to show you guys. But anyways, that was it was just this vignetted painting of a like space soldier from the future, just walking towards the camera. And I obsessed over that. I think I redrew it a million times. So yeah, that was a big one. Funny little probably hard to find piece.
Thank you. Just so the audience knows, we have one more early life question, then I'll get to those two questions about your time at the academy.
Cool.
So the question is, was your family supportive of your switch to art? If not, how did you move past it? If so, how important was their support?
So yeah, I'm pretty fortunate in that my family, most of them, I'd say all of them, were very supportive. I know that I've heard a lot of stories from a lot of artists who didn't have that same kind of support, and it's very unfortunate. But they were actually, when I switched my degree from science to art, my actual aunt and uncle, who were scientists, both were like, finally, he finally left that. We were worried you were going down the wrong path. So I had a lot of support, and it meant a lot to me. It let me know that that I was doing the right thing. It's easy to second guess yourself when you're trying to become a professional artist, and there's lots of other options of, I guess, less exciting jobs that I could have easily done, but I wanted to, I don't know, I had enough support for me to think like, this is the right path, and that I'm just going to keep going down it. I rarely had moments where I was like, this isn't right. And I think that came from the family support that I had.
Thank you. Somebody asked, who were your teachers at the Academy of Art, and did they help steer you in a particular artistic direction?
Yeah. Oh man, that's so many. Honestly, every teacher I had there was really incredible. The few that stood out as ones that really pushed my work to the place I wanted it to be were, number one was an artist named Bill Mon, who still runs the program there. He does a lot of Western work, and now he does a lot of gallery work. But he was just a jack of all trades illustrator in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. He went to Art Center with I think Craig Nelson, who's also a teacher at the Academy. Another artist that was really helpful to me was a English artist named Stephen Player. He was one of the teachers there. My figure drawing artist, Lisa Barrett, was a huge help. And then I had I did a lot of fine art work with a truly incredible fine artist. His name is Xiaoming Wu, just this incredible figure painter. And I think I learned a lot more about oil painting from him than anyone else. He's just this master of edge control and color and atmosphere. I mean, he makes paintings of figures that look like landscape paintings, if that makes any sense. If you look up his work, Xiaoming Wu, it'll make sense when you see it. It's like, wow, these paintings of human figures look like just beautiful landscapes. So yeah, those are a lot of the influences I had. And I worked with some folks on my way at the tail end of my career. I worked with a couple of artists at Pixar who were helpful to me. Randy Barrett, who is a matte painter there, and Tim Avat, who is a sketch artist there. And they were really helpful in sort of helping me figure out whether I wanted to do visual development work or illustration work, because they both had experience in those two fields. But yeah, that's a long list of people, but I guess we all come from tons of influences and artists that are very helpful.
Thank you. Perfect. I know we have a lot of exciting things to go through, so we'll go ahead and continue if that's all right with you, and we'll get to the rest of the questions at the end. Yep.
Great. So after, I'll just jump back into the slides here if they're still up. Are they still up, Drew?
They're still up. Yep.
Okay, cool. So after I got out of school, I think I floated around for 6 months, kind of panicking as to whether I was going to be able to get work. And I did work here and there for really tiny companies like Fantasy Flight Games and a few other little ones here and there. And I was looking at video game companies to go to. But then I got a call, thanks to Irene Gallo at Tour. She had given my name over to John Shindahedi at D&D in Wizards of the Coast. And John messaged me and asked me if I wanted to do Dungeons and Dragons work. So I immediately said yes, of course. Didn't even ask what the job was. Because, I mean, as we were talking earlier, I kind of grew up with that game. And it never really hit my mind while I was in art school that it would be something I would work for. I was just kind of figuring out how to find work. And it turns out that Dungeons and Dragons needed a lot of work, and a lot of my favorite artists came through there. Bram started pretty heavily with, I think you guys had a talk with Bram. He probably talked about his early work with D&D. Tony Derlizzi, of course. So it was a dream come true, really. And then I feel like I fumbled the ball a little bit. This is the first piece that I did for D&D, and as an artist, it's one of those pieces that I cringe when I look at it. But my wife has told me pretty strongly that it looks great and I shouldn't worry about it. But I do like to show people this because for me, I feel like I didn't do as good as I could have, maybe because I was stressed or, it was my first big job. But it also shows that, every artist grows as they move through their career and their life. And this was my first big production piece. So there it is. I don't know what to say about it. Let's move on so I don't have to look at it. So I started doing a lot more D&D work. This is my first cover for D&D for Dragon magazine. This is where I really got to play with their D&D has all kinds of crazy monsters, and I got to kind of try my hand at adjusting their designs and taking something that was pretty cartoony reference that I received and turning it into something that's more towards the more realistic look that I want in my work. And it's getting closer, I think. Getting closer. This was yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I was just wondering, how much of a say do you have in setting up your compositions for D&D and Magic and for choosing the subject matter?
The subject matter is often chosen by them. Usually their writers write up an art description. and they know what they want. But the composition is actually, they're really good at leaving it up to me to decide. Their kind of golden rule there is to not pin the camera down. And when I say that, they try not to be too prescriptive as to where you view the scene. So for something like this, they're like, well, we want the big demon in the middle. And in fact, they didn't even say that. They're just like, there's a couple of fighters fighting a demon. Then it's up to me to how to frame that. Do I want a low camera, high camera? Do I want to zoomed in? All of those are my decisions. And I can run a few options by them, and then they'll decide like, oh, we like this one the most. Let's go with that one. But they're really good at not pinning the camera down when it comes to art descriptions. And I've experienced jobs where they've excessively pinned the camera down, and it's a really breath of fresh air when an art director is not trying to do that to you.
Perfect.
So yeah, well, moving on here. So this was my first cover, and this next one is I'm going to show you folks, like as we go through these, a lot of pieces that I would consider basically breakthrough pieces for me. This is where I got to play around with composition a lot more, with this really hot color line coming down, and then the rest of it's all pretty gray, and then a lot of motion. This was a piece that really, I don't know, it's where I kind of got to push my images more towards the vision that I had in my head. And that can take a long time to figure out as an artist. To really, there's an image in our head all the time, or in my head all the time. And it's a challenge early on when you don't have the experience, or you haven't put enough hours into making images to get that image perfectly on the page. And this is one where I got extremely close to that image in my head. And you'll also see when I go back one slide, the difference between these two is that these two sort of mark the transition where I left working in oils and began working digitally. So the previous image, this one, is almost entirely painted in oils with some digital adjustments. And then this one is entirely digital. And I made this transition simply because for me, for production art for me, there was a lot of in-between work where I would paint most of it, and then I would photograph it, and then I would make a lot of additions, or the client needed all kinds of changes, and I would make those changes. And it was the pace of production work that I was doing pretty much forced me into a digital space, because it was so much easier to make changes. It was so much easier to do quick turnarounds for the high level of production work, or high rate of production work that needs to be done for video games and tabletop games. So after these, I'd say after this piece and maybe one or two before this, I went fully digital until a couple years ago. So, I'll keep moving along here. These were the ones that Jesse had showed a minute ago. The I would say famous now covers for Dungeons and Dragons. This is the Player's Handbook, one of the core books for 5th edition. And this is the Dungeon Master's Guide, another one of the core books for 5th edition. I can't tell you how much of an honor it was for them to ask me to do these paintings, because the core books for D&D have only been painted by a handful of artists since since 73, I guess, when the first books came out. So yeah, I was thrilled to get to work on these. So that kind of brings me into the realm of Magic the Gathering. So I did all that D&D work.
I'm sorry, Tyler.
Yeah,
we have a load of like D&D specific questions.
Yeah,
so
yeah, let's do it.
Get a few of those. Thank you.
Yeah, before we go down the Magic rabbit hole, let's get some.
Yeah, because I'm sure we'll have a bunch for that too. So anyways, the first question is, how many pieces have you done for D&D / Wizards of the Coast now? And do you have a favorite?
Oh, wow. I think, so I do have a favorite. It's funny, I can actually count the jobs. If I open I don't know if you probably can't see this, but I can at least count. If I open my folders, I have the way I organize my work. So I have done I'd say it looks like 85 individual jobs for D&D, but each job has been way more than one piece of art. So it's got to be well over 150 pieces of art for D&D.
Hmm.
My favorite one is, so it's probably down to a 2. It's probably down to this one that's up on the screen now, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and that red dragon piece that Jesse showed early on. The reason is the red dragon, of course, is just like one of the most legendary creatures in D&D. It's been depicted by absolute legends, Jeff Easley. There's some really amazing design work for the dragons done by Todd Lockwood. So those getting to do a red dragon, getting to paint a red dragon for D&D is kind of like a bucket list thing. So that's another one of my favorites. And then I put the Dungeon Master's Guide here up there as well, because this was one of those perfect storms, I would say. They needed it in a week. And obviously I can't say no. It's the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a very, very famous book to get to do the cover for. So so the perfect storm is that I had to do it really fast. The rush jobs can often be not satisfying because you never really get to get the piece to where you want it. But I was able to get this piece to where I wanted it because the art director, Shauna Narciso, she didn't really want to change anything. She was like, I want you to handle this. It's your vision. Go for it. And she just handed it to me and I made it what I wanted it to be, which is also a rare occurrence. So it was a number of things that came together and made it really work. And I'm super happy with the piece. So it's kind of lived on as one of my favorites.
Thank you. Another question is, if you were to redo your first artwork for D&D, how would you remake it and why?
Oh, wow. The way I would remake it is I would do a lot more preliminary work. I think that's the biggest way to fail on a piece is to not do enough preliminary work. I think the great rule a lot of people say is, that a painting is 90% preparation and 10% execution. Or maybe a different ratio, but I think it's more 90 to 10. And I think I put way less into the preparation for that piece than I did in the final. So I would get better reference. I would, if I were doing it today, I would get a way better reference. I'd probably make 3D models for a number of things to get the lighting just right. And there would be a lot of other steps I would take before I would tackle it. And I know a lot more about painting now, so it's hard for me I like to beat myself up about that original piece, but I just know so much more about painting than I did back then. So that's a hard thing to correct. I could redo it now because I know so much more now, but yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but
Perfect. We have one more D&D question and we can move on. They ask,
sure.
Can you talk a bit about what a typical brief for D&D or Magic the Gathering looks like and what references you're provided for that sort of work?
Oh yeah, great. And I can obviously chat more about Magic when it comes to that, but D&D and Magic have fairly different formats for their art descriptions. I would say D&D is a bit wordier because there's a lot more that tends to be going on when it comes to storytelling that is required for their illustrations. They tend to exist in books, and they usually are tied into illustrating a very particular aspect of a story campaign. So there's a lot more going on in the descriptions usually for D&D. And it means there's usually a lot more characters, a lot more complicated things that have to be solved, lighting issues, and there's a lot going on. And I'd say the big difference between that and Magic is Magic tends to be a bit more, say, simple but concise when it comes to their descriptions because you're dealing with a 2-inch illustration window. It lives on a card that's this big, where D&D lives on big book covers. So there's a different target you're trying to hit there. A much bigger grab on a book cover or a big full page spread. So I guess if it comes down to just the simple differences, D&D is usually much more complicated. The reference they provide is actually they do quite a lot of visual development for both D&D and Magic. So their reference is very robust. There's usually an entire world guide that you receive, which is a big giant PDF full of a full explanation of the universe that you're working in, what almost everything looks like in that universe, so that you avoid generic solves. So there's not just generic looking armor and generic looking swords. There's usually a style to swords and armor and culture. All of those things are established in the visual development, which we'll go into in a little bit when we get into my slides. But yeah, both Magic and D&D have really robust world guides and reference packs that they send to you.
Tyler, if I could just ask, what type of character do you play, and are you a lawful good or a chaotic neutral guy?
I sometimes like to be neutral or chaotic neutral for sure. And I'm almost always, well, when I was younger, I was always a barbarian. Obviously, the easy go-to, be a barbarian. But if I'm going to play now with some friends of mine, I like to really do the role play aspect of D&D. I really want to try and be something that's not my character, that's not me in reality. I want to be like Daniel Day-Lewis in D&D. So I really want to put on a different persona. And I tend to play either warlocks or some sort of thiefy guy, a rogue or a ranger or something like that.
Right.
When I play.
All set to move on with the slides. I know we have 2 themes left to go over.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay, let's move into, okay, so Magic and D&D are part of the same company. If anyone out there is not aware, they're part of a company called Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast originally was a company that just owned Magic, and then they purchased TSR, which was the original company that made D&D. So they work on the same floor, actually, and all the art directors know each other, and they look at each brand's artist pool. And so what happened to me was had been doing so much work for D&D, and John Shindahedi and Kate Irwin and Mary Kowalski, who worked over there, that they started seeing my work on the Magic side. And the art director on the Magic side was a guy named Jeremy Jarvis. At that time, he had been the lead art director for Magic for about 10 years. And he gave me a chance. I remember he emailed me and said, hey, do you want to try out 2 test illustrations, which is typically how we would start people on Magic. And so I was given my first one, which is a pretty famous Magic card called Sneak Attack. But Magic reprints cards over and over again, and they always do very, very different illustrations whenever they reprint one. So this was my approach to a famous Magic card called Sneak Attack. And it's big up on the screen, but this printed at 2 inches. So that's the major difference, I would say, between this kind of work and this kind of work, is that this has to hold up at a very, very small size. And that's a whole different solve, I would say, when it comes to illustration work. So this started me down the road to Magic the Gathering work. Jeremy Jarvis felt that piece was good enough, so I continued to work for them and have worked for them for about 10 years now. This is a big milestone piece for me in Magic. It's a big 2-headed ogre that I got to design named Rurik Thar. For me, I don't know, it was just a great opportunity for me to spotlight a silhouette. So he's kind of spotlit here in the middle of his torso, but he still has a really clear silhouette, and he survives again at that 2-inch scale, which is can often be really challenging if your work doesn't have really clear silhouettes, or we call it figure ground relationship. So if the figure and the background don't stand out from each other really strongly, it's not a really successful illustration for Magic. So I try to tell young artists to look at Magic cards and see the really successful ones, and if it's the kind of work they want to do, try and fill their portfolio up with stuff that has that kind of relationship, that figure ground relationship, strong silhouettes. And this was a piece for me that I thought worked really well for that. And it kind of sent me down a new reinvented my style, I guess, when it comes to doing magic work.
It kind of sounds like answering this question already, but they asked, how do you make an artwork hold up at a smaller card size?
That's it. I mean, it has to do with, I mean, there's a formula, sure, and you'll see a lot of artists do this where they have a strong silhouette and their character's usually spotlit, and then there's a sort of medium value background. That's the best solve. But if you really dig through a lot of the really successful and really well done magic cards, you'll see there are other ways to do it that work really well. But it is about contrast. Strong contrast helps. Good edge control. It's really hard to deal with really blurry and soft edge transitions in magic because it's such a small frame. And then good value control. So if your work doesn't have a really clear value pattern between the lights and the darks, it won't stand up at 2 inches. So those are a few things that you kind of have to track when you're building a magic card. I think the next area I'm going to move into is I've done a lot of magic work and D&D work, but I've also done work for publications. So this is a piece for Scientific American about early humans crossing the land bridge into North America, probably roughly from the archaeology 15,000-ish years ago, 12,000 years ago. So this is really fun to work on because it's not fantasy, but it gives me the opportunity to play around with science a little bit. I actually had to work, because it's Scientific American, I had to work with a number of scientists on detail accuracy. I think that if you look down in the corner, there's a figure with a spear climbing a rock. I think I had to repaint that spearhead like 5 times because each version wasn't as accurate as it could be to the archaeological evidence. So it's a fun job in that I got to experience that sort of how can I, as an artist, depict what the scientists want to see in the illustration. This is a piece I did for Tour for Wheel of Time. So it's a, Wheel of Time is a very famous series, but it's a bit different from D&D. D&D is pretty loud and swords and sorcery and dragons and flames and lots of crazy magic. And Wheel of Time series is a lot more subtle when it comes to that. So this is me getting to play in a fantasy space that's more subtle, and then I don't know, just a lot more fun. I wouldn't say more fun, but it's an interesting, different challenge to solve different subject matter and get a different feeling than D&D. So it's not always painting D&D or magic. I'm actually trying to solve other fantasy properties that have a different mood. And this is a piece again for that brand that I mentioned earlier, Warhammer 40K. This was a huge influence for me when I was a kid growing up. The artwork done in that by people like Carl Kopinski and Paul Dayton and Adrian Smith. Those guys really, I guess, showed me the direction where I could take some of my work into this. This stuff's pretty gnarly and scary looking, but I really like that kind of work. And a lot of the work I've done in my career has at least been geared somewhat towards this kind of stuff. And I've only done a few jobs for Games Workshop, but this one was one of my first, and I had such a fun time painting my take on characters and creatures that I got to play with when I was a kid, when they were little tiny 1-inch miniatures. So this was a super fun job for me. Oh, okay. So I think this is a good place to break before, and we could talk more questions. Before I get into, I'd like to chat with everyone about, or at least give them a short tour of my visual development work, the stuff that's not illustration, but it's more concept art.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. I'd like to make these questions quick if possible, because I know you have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, as you say. The first question is, what is your process for getting prompt on card and its stats and mechanics to making the final piece?
Oh, great. Great question. So one thing they're very guarded about, and specifically, is they do not tell us the rules for the art or for the card. The reason for this is it's distracting, number one. And because of that distraction, it can cause the artist to actually solve the image in the wrong way. So they're really specific about not letting us see what the rules are, so that they can, as the art directors, can guide the image without the distraction. It's very easy to read the rules of a card and be like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this. And it can often be counter to what the designers want the card to actually look like. So we really almost never get the rules. The one thing they will give you rules wise, because Magic is such a rules intensive game, is that some creatures have flying and they need to be depicted as having flying. And that's by actually flying or have wings or something like that. They need to appear to be flying. That's all. I'd say that's the most they ever go to when it comes to rules. And occasionally, if it gets really hard to solve the image, they will then bring the rules up, and maybe that'll help change the artist's perspective. But most of the time, they avoid even bringing it up. What was the other part of the question? Was it something to do with the art description?
And its stats and mechanics to making the final piece.
Right. So we don't get any of the stats or mechanics. We get the creature, or we get the card type. So whether it's a creature or a spell, we get the color, because sometimes that's really important to how you construct the image and how it lives on the card with all the graphic design that goes into a Magic card. So let's say it's a blue card, you know, you kind of want to key your image towards blue, or at least a complement to blue. So it's a fairly orange image. So those are the kinds of things that they don't tell us the mechanics. And yeah, and then they're as a company, they're really good at not nailing the camera down. So we have a lot of freedom to make the composition the way we need it.
Thank you. Another
No
question
problem.
is,
Great question.
they ask, how did you make the transition from working for games to also doing work for more serious publications?
I wouldn't say it was a big transition. I was kind of doing them side by side. So when I got out of art school, I would say maybe 6 months to a year out of art school, I started working with Richard Solomon in New York City. And most of the work I did with him was not fantasy at all. It was all publishing. I think the reason I put mostly fantasy in this slideshow for you guys is because the Enchanted show is all themed off fantasy. But I've done a lot of work for, you know, like Rolling Stone, Entertainment Weekly, advertising work for television. That's all pretty much non-fantasy stuff. I did some Bollywood movie posters and stuff like that were pretty fun. So I was doing that at the same time as I started working on D&D and Magic. So I kind of had two worlds and almost two styles. If we go back, like these two were done for publishing, and I kind of was working in a slightly different style, at least to my eye, than this kind of stuff, which is a lot more organic, and these are a little more hard-edged and chiseled out. So I was doing them in tandem, and it was kind of interesting, at least from my perspective now, looking back on it, that I had two kind of different styles going on. Now I would say that I just paint things in my one style, the way I want to paint them. But there's been a lot of jobs in the past where I have painted in such a way that I felt like this is what they want stylistically. It's not what I want stylistically. So yeah, but I would say, you know, to shorten that down, I was doing them at the same time. There wasn't a transition between one to the other. I was just doing non-fantasy work and fantasy work at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we're all set to move on. I do want to quickly say, it is 6:24. We can go a little bit longer if that's all right with you, Tyler.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, shoot. I was talking a lot, huh?
No, you have really thoughtful answers, so it's great. And I also
Yeah,
just
I'm happy to go a lot longer. I mean, or not a lot longer, but how about I kind of jump through this visual development stuff and just give like a broad chat about concept art, and then we can just look at those last images that I had. Oh, I also have some little process stuff at the end too. But yeah, let's jump into it. So I also do a lot of visual development work for Magic the Gathering and D&D. This is a different kind of art solve. It has to do with a lot of, I would say, nuts and bolts of development. You know, if you're creating a new world, you want to know what all their costuming is. You want to know what all their weapons look like, what their horses look like, what do the creatures in this world look like, what's the architecture. All of these things are thought about, and we bring in teams of artists, usually 5 for 3 weeks, to go through all of this stuff. So this is me exploring how all of this particular Rakdos culture and what their costuming looks like at silhouette level, because silhouette's really important to Magic. This is some Gruul guys, like how do they tattoo themselves? What do they build their clothing out of? These guys are kind of in that Mad Max type realm, so they build their stuff out of, it's Mad Max without cars, you know, so they build their stuff with bones and rope and other things like that. I really enjoy visual development, sort of creating new characters. So these are some explorations of pirate captains for a set that was called Ixalan. Another thing I really love working on is creatures. So this is oftentimes creatures are, how do we theme a creature? Is it just a big monster, or what's its influences? So I was looking at, I needed to make an ogre or a troll, one of the two. And I was looking at the skin pattern and dappling of Indian elephants. So I kind of wanted to bring in a little bit of that morphology and creature anatomy into a bipedal monster. Other things you have to think about when you're doing this kind of development is scale reference. You know, if this guy's a big giant ogre, how do we show that he's a big ogre on a card? Well, like most of us know how big roughly a sword is or a helmet. So we kind of made his belt out of swords. That's a great way to sneak in a little bit of reference. Obviously, a human head hanging off a belt is a good reference too, but it's a little macabre, and it often gets edited out of Magic cards because it is, of course, a kid's game. Sometimes character design is really fun and weird. This is a giant that I had to do for D&D. Again, I snuck in scale reference by putting helmets and swords and little things snuck in there, coins and stuff like that, so you can get an idea of how big this nasty monster is. Sometimes visual development for Magic is solving their iconic characters. So this is a big demon. Again, scale reference sometimes is hard, so you just got to throw in a regular figure right next to them. Here's some more of that pirate set, exploring costume design. This is all fun stuff for me because I don't have to really worry about getting a full illustration finished, but I can surround myself with all sorts of period references, like how swords were made in this time period and how belts worked and jackets. And then I can tailor all that stuff for the Magic setting. And it starts creating really cool opportunities for costume design and making something appear like it's in its own world. Now, another big challenge in visual development, especially for Magic and D&D, is that you need to set the mood for a particular set. So this isn't necessarily designing anything specific, but it's giving you a feel for what this story point is going to be like. And I've done that a number of times. This is for Dominaria, one of their legendary characters. He's a wizard, Teferi, but he's also a time traveler. So how do we get those themes in? It's the old version of him, but then there's a statue of him when he was younger, and that's a great way to depict the feeling of this particular set, which is about traveling to the past. This particular set is that pirate set, so it has to do a lot with Mesoamerican influences and medieval Spanish influences. So we themed the Spaniards were evil vampires, which I thought was appropriate for history. And then the Mesoamerican culture were incredibly powerful and rode on giant dinosaurs with colorful feathers. This is a really fun set for me. I did a lot of work for it, but we wanted to set the mood, and the mood was sort of influenced from those old Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth pirate paintings. And I found like this was a great way to get that feeling for the set. This is a fairy tale set we were working on, but it was also kind of a darker twist to the fairy tales. So yeah, that was just kind of a quick, I know we're running low on time, so that was just kind of a quick tour through the specific aspects of visual development for Magic and D&D. The asks for concept art for video games is actually very different than from tabletop, because video games tend to have to exist in 3 dimensions, so you need to show the characters from all angles and design them from all angles. Whereas D&D and Magic, you often only really have to design the characters at the front because they're going to exist either on a little tiny card or in a small illustration. So you don't have to do too much of the exploration of the back of them because you're only ever going to really see them from the front on these cards. So it's a different solve, but it also, there's a lot of culture that you have to build into all these worlds that we've worked on. But that kind of gets to the end of the concept art. If people have questions about that, we can go into that.
We have a couple questions. Somebody asked, do you often reference older works such as Pyle and Wyeth when creating something new?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have a big collection of Golden Age illustrators that I really love. I always look at Pyle and Wyeth a lot, but I tend to dig into people like Tom Lovell and Dean Cornwell are a couple of my favorites from back then. Always love Rockwell stuff, especially if something calls for being a little bit more designed. I'll look at people like J.C. Leindecker and Norman Rockwell because they were really great designers, and you can see how their design levels kind of influence people like Strusen, who influenced me. And so whenever I have to do a design-y piece, I tend to look at those guys as well as Strusen because they're all of them are really great designers.
Thank you. This one's maybe not so concept related, but we've had it for a long time. So I want to ask, I've noticed you use limited palettes a lot in your larger illustrations. Could you talk about that decision?
Yeah. Color theory was actually really difficult for me to tackle when I was in art school. So the way I was able to figure it out was to work from gray. So most of my early stuff was working from gray, and just as a, when you work from gray, the result tends to be limited palette because everything's pretty gray and you're just trying to force in just a little bit of color. So I tend to like that look, more muted things. And it's kind of just become how I paint everything. And now that in the past couple of years, I've been switching back to painting in oils again. And it's actually become a pretty big asset. I'm already in the mindset of painting with limited colors. And so when I put my paints down, I only pick a few tubes and I work from that theory as opposed to all the colors on my palette. But it's its own special challenge working digitally with a limited palette because Photoshop, if you're painting in Photoshop or any of the digital tools, you have all the colors in the universe available to you. So it's hard to not pick those colors, and it really forces your mind to understand what colors you should be using and whatnot. So there's, I guess, through the brute force of digital work, I was able to understand color theory a lot better because I couldn't use all the millions of colors that were available to me, or it would have looked really strange.
Thank you. We have another question they asked. How did you first become aware of Golden Age illustrators?
Oh man, that was in art school for sure. I was loosely aware of a lot of them growing up. I grew up with, I think, 3 giant Norman Rockwell painting books in my house. But that was about it. That was my exposure, I think, when I was a kid to people of that age. And I know Rockwell is sort of after the golden age, if you want to break the ages down into little smaller ages. But it wasn't really till art school that I started hearing all these other names from my teachers and fellow artists, and then I started digging in and finding all these great books that contained their work. And back then, it wasn't that long ago, but I guess it was about 12 years now for me. But back then, there wasn't a lot of those. Most of the great books, like the Dean Cornwell book and the J.C. Leyendecker books were all out of print, so it was really hard to find them. I'm glad, at least in the past decade, there's been a number of publishers that have brought a lot of those books back. I know the Andrew Loomis books were really hard to find back then. Now you can actually find them. So oftentimes we would go to old bookstores or to Comic Cons, and places like Bud Plant would have old versions of like the Dean Cornwell book for like $600. You could get this Dean Cornwell book. Or if you had $250, you could get this old J.C. Leyendecker book that didn't have really great reproductions in it, but it was at least a J.C. Leyendecker book. So I started learning a lot about those Golden Age guys back then, and I think one of us in the studio was able to get that Cornwell book, and we would all just crowd around them and look at it. But yeah, those are interesting times. I'm really glad there's a lot of people bringing back a lot of those books. People like Flesk and Illustrated Press, I believe they've been doing some great stuff. So.
Thank you. I think we're all set to move on.
Cool. So the last little bits of stuff I just wanted to tour everyone through some of my favorite paintings. This is just a big dragon. It's one of my favorites because I got to play around with how light passes through thin membranes of skin, so subsurface scattering. And I like designing monsters, so I got to play around with, a 6-limbed creature, 2 wings and back legs and front legs. This is a really fun one for me, and I thought it was really successful. And it's limited palette again. This is another favorite of mine from Magic. It's Jace. I have to have a lot of fun with lighting and color. He's in a dark room, but he's a very blue character, so it's you have to kind of get all of his blues in there. It's the idea is, if you're painting the X-Men, you kind of have to paint to Marvel's style of the X-Men, right? So if you're painting Wolverine, he has to have that yellow outfit. And it has to appear yellow, even if he's in a particular lighting scenario. So this was a fun challenge to get this branded character through. And I got to get a bit of mood and mystery into it, which was really fun. This one was great. They used it in a video. So when I painted this digitally, all the elements of her are on different layers. Her spearhead and her arm and her body and the wings are all on different layers. So they animated it to parallax at the camera, at the camera lens. That was super fun to work with the video guys on that. Unfortunately, I don't have a sample of how they animated it, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. This is the piece that Jesse had mentioned that'll be traveling. It's Swatley. She's a character that I designed for the Ixalan set. This is a favorite of mine because I actually designed her entire look as a planeswalker for Magic. And then I got the Illustrator character card along with the cool little dinosaur familiar. I guess it's really big. This is another breakthrough piece for me, the Exalted Angel for Magic. I think this is where I kind of brought my use of reference. I think I resisted using reference a lot before this. For some reason, there's a deep, dark history of artists that look down on reference and then artists that embrace the use of reference. And I learned a lot that I should have embraced the use of reference much earlier in my career. And I used a lot of reference for this one, and it was massively helpful. So all you young artists out there, if anyone tells you not to use reference, tell them they're wrong and that they should use reference. And look at any Norman Rockwell piece. He used a lot of reference. This was a fun piece I did for D&D. So I got to paint a whole lot of weird mushrooms, and it's a demon that's actually made out of mushrooms. This one was super fun because it might have been one of the more colorful pieces I'd done in my career. So I only picked this one because I had such a good time with it. This is the Sword Coast Adventurers Guide. I threw this one in because I worked with a friend of mine who works at D&D, and we kind of just came up with what's the quintessential D&D image. And D&D as a game is about adventurers working together. So why shouldn't that be exactly what's depicted on the cover? So we kind of created this scene of this team of adventurers being surrounded at their campsite. And I just had so much fun giving everyone their own little character and their own gear, and kind of really embodied the nature of D&D as a game, and what to expect when you play it. So I think this is one of my most successful D&D images from a personal standpoint. And if anything was more successful in D&D than as a D&D image, it was this one, because it's easily one of my all-time favorites for D&D. And this was born out of just a concept plate that I did on a concept push for D&D, where we were designing all the new giants. And this was just a small black and white piece, and they asked me to turn it into the cover for the Volo's guidebook. So I got to actually take a piece that I didn't really even finish, almost abandoned, and got to really go in there and bring it to life as a full image, and actually build some story into it. You know, I spent a lot of time working on this main giant's, the way he's leaning his shoulder in, and the way he's lifting his hand to stop the giant from behind him, who clearly just wants to eat this guy. He's sort of like, hold on, I want to listen to what he has to say. So I got to actually build in a lot of storytelling with just a little bit of gesture and a little bit of character movement. And of course, all of that was cropped out when they printed it on the cover of the book. So that always happens. And then the last one I wanted to show, which will lead into some little quick videos I can play for you guys, is I recently started working in oils again. So this is one of the first oil pieces I did for Magic ever. I did it a couple years ago. And it's just a big Kraken piece in the ocean. So it was good. I got to break out the oils again and paint this guy. And I have a little, see if I can share something different here. Let me see if I can share a video real quick. I have a couple videos I could share with you guys. Okay, here we go. This is a little video that can show you the process I took with this. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just a short little video to show how I went through the painting process, so you can get an idea of how I tend to work in sections. Block in pretty heavily and then start refining the details. Do that one more time just so you can see. All right, kind of laid in the ocean, started laying in the aspects of this creature, and then started hitting all the details in my focal points. And if we have time, I can play a couple more little time lapses of how I do oils, and we can just chat while they play. Here's just one I was doing of a portrait of Sigourney Weaver from Aliens, a favorite movie of mine, by James Cameron in the 80s, sequel to Alien.
Did you want to have questions while the video was playing in the background?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll just, I think there's like 4 of these little time lapses, maybe 5, and I'll just cycle through them while we chat.
Sounds good. We have a few more questions and then we can look to wrap it up.
Awesome.
So somebody asked, why did you switch back from digital to oils?
The main reason is that I wanted to get back into oils specifically because I've missed, there's 2 reasons. You can sell Magic originals there's a big market for Magic originals. So it was a great way for me to actually kind of pace myself down a little bit. Production art can be pretty high turnaround, you know, lots and lots of stuff all the time, late nights, weekends, sort of a never-ending schedule thing. So I wanted to be able to slow down that work a little bit, but also create an artifact again, which is something I've missed when I've switched to digital, is to not have this actual artifact and the craft of painting with oils, which I really enjoy, you know, learning all the science and the chemistry around it. So it was great to get back into that, and then on the back end there's a great market of collectors that really love Magic originals, and they're all really great folks. So it's a nice little arena to move into, in order to, the selling of the selling of original artwork is a great way to sort of make up for the less production work I have to take on in order to accommodate the time that it takes to work on these. So it was kind of a joint push for me to do that, to switch. It was a way to slow down production art and a way to compensate for that lack of work by selling the original paintings. And I'm having just a great time. I've been able to reconstitute a whole section of my studio to actually be an oil painting setup, and it's really bringing me back to the early work that I did as an illustrator, which is all in oils. So it's a nostalgic process, and I've had to actually sort of relearn how to ride that bike. Apparently you do forget how to do that stuff.
Hey, Tyler, can people still contribute to the Kickstarter for your book?
Yes, absolutely. It's open, I think, for 15, 16 more days. So we've reached our second stretch goal, and we're going to be introducing a third one here probably at the end of the week. So hopefully people can help us push even farther and get some more content. But we'll be announcing that later in the week. But anyone can go to the link that you guys might have posted somewhere, but they can go to either my website, and there's a banner on my website that'll take you to the Kickstarter, or you can just search for The Art of Tyler Jacobson on Kickstarter, and you'll see the book that is being put together. It's almost all finished. It's all that hard work of creating the book is being done by John Flesk and his folks, Kathy and Vicky. They've all been doing an incredible job laying out the whole book, and there's some samples of the layouts on the Kickstarter if you go on there. But if this slideshow has been a little tiny tour of my career, the books, I think we're at a little over 160 pages, so there's a lot of stuff to see in there. It'll be great.
Right.
I think this might be a good question to end it on. I do want to say, if anybody in the in-person audience has any questions, we do have a microphone that I can bring over to you. Just raise your hand. But anyways, the question is, what was the last piece you did for yourself?
Oh, wow. This is something that I've talked with my wife a lot about, because it's not something I make a lot of time for, but I encourage any artists in the audience or anyone watching to do it. I almost never do it, but the time lapses I'm showing you right now are actually pieces I did for myself on a little stream that I do called Live Brush with my friend Ray Bonilla. I would say my favorite one is actually the one I just played you, the time lapse of the little predator. I've been trying to do little paintings of some of my favorite movies, and that's sort of the only time I've had for personal work. So I encourage everyone to make time for it. It's something I should do a lot more, because it's easy to make a mental distinction between work and having fun. So when you actually do personal work, it kind of gets you more excited to do your production work. And so I've been lately, in the past few years, I've been trying to take every opportunity I can to make more paintings, even if they're just little silly portraits like these, or just fun personal stuff. I've been exploring a lot of digital tools as well. So I highly encourage it, even though I don't follow my own advice often.
Thank you. I think this has been a great discussion. Okay, no questions. All right. Before I wrap it up, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. You all are a part of a growing community of people who understand the work of illustration artists and the profound effect it has on the way we think of things. There's been around 400 people gathered here tonight watching throughout all our platforms, and I just want to thank you all for making this a great discussion. Our next program in a week on the 27th, we'll be talking with Scott Gustafson, an illustrator who's well known for his work on classics such as Peter Pan, The Night Before Christmas, and many more. Feel free to reserve your spot now. And one more thing before we wrap it up, I want to invite anyone to consider becoming a part of the community in a greater way by becoming a member and making a gift to support this work. I just dropped a link in the chat. And once again, I just want to thank Jesse for being here. I want to thank Tyler for being a pleasure to work with and having very thoughtful answers. And I've been Drew. No
Thank
problem.
you so much, Drew. You've done a great job, man. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I've been Drew Dragonslayer Thomas, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.